The morning the big green tractor arrived next door was a Tuesday in early May of 1993. I remember the air had that particular cool, damp weight to it that promises a warm afternoon. The kind of morning where the fog hangs low in the hollows and you can smell the soil waking up. I was out with my team, Jacob and Esau, a pair of Belgian geldings with shoulders wider than a church door, turning over the north pasture. We were moving at our usual pace, a rhythm the land has known for 1,000 years before a gear was ever ground or a piston fired. The only sounds were the jingle of the harness, the soft tear of the plowshare through the loam, and my own voice, low and steady, making small corrections. Then came the other sound, a deep, percussive rumble that shook the fence posts, followed by the high, insistent whine of a diesel engine under load. A long flatbed truck was backing down my neighbor's drive, and on its deck sat the single biggest piece of farm machinery I had ever seen outside of a dealer's lot. It was gleaming, immaculate, the paint so bright it hurt the eyes. Dave, my neighbor, stood beside it, arms crossed, wearing a brand new cap that matched the tractor's color. He was a good man, Dave, but he was a man who believed in progress, and to him, progress came with a financing plan and a warranty. He saw me across the fence line, standing with my hands on the worn wooden handles of my walking plow, the two big horses waiting patiently, their breath misting in the cool air. He gave a wave that was half friendly greeting, half proud salute to his new acquisition. I waved back. The truck driver unchained the tractor and it crawled off the flatbed with a roar, its tires taller than my fence. It left ruts in the gravel drive that would be there until the next hard rain. Dave climbed up into the glass-enclosed cab, a space bigger than the pantry in my house, and the thing moved off toward his fields. The sound of it faded a little, replaced by the chirping of sparrows in the hedgerow, but the quiet felt different now. It felt older, smaller. By noon, the diner in town had the story. Dave had traded in his 5-year-old machine for the new model, the one with 250 horsepower and a guidance system that practically drove itself. The talk was all horsepower and bushels per acre, and how you couldn't make a living anymore farming 40 acres at a time. Someone mentioned my name and the fact I was still farming with horses. There was a moment of silence, the kind that's not quite respectful. It was followed by a low chuckle. I heard about it later from the fellow who runs the feed co-op. He meant no harm. He was just reporting the weather. They're saying you're the last man in 3 counties turning dirt with hair and hide, he told me, leaning on a stack of feed sacks. What are you doing with 2 fat horses on 80 acres of good bottom land? He asked it like a man asking a riddle he already knows the answer to. I told him I was farming. He just shook his head, a little smile playing on his lips. Well, he said, pushing a receipt across the counter, long as you're paying your bills. I didn't take it personally. How could they understand? They saw an old man with old animals using an old method. They saw a refusal to change, a stubbornness that bordered on foolishness. They saw inefficiency. They saw a man losing a race against time. What they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the ground itself. They looked at the crop, but they never looked at the soil that fed it. I didn't know everything then, not by a long shot, but I suspected the horses knew something the tractor didn't, and I was beginning to think my grandfather had known it too. It was a secret kept not in a vault, but in the first 8 inches of dirt, a secret that was getting heavier and more compacted every year on every other farm but mine. They saw the past. I was trying to listen to it. I want to be honest about my reasons. It wasn't just sentiment, though there was some of that. I'd grown up on this place, walked these same fields behind my grandfather and his team of percherons. I remembered the weight of his hand on my shoulder, the smell of horse sweat and warm leather and turned earth. He had a way of talking about the land, not as a thing to be conquered, but there's a partner in a slow, lifelong dance. The ground remembers every heavy foot that walks on it, he used to say, his voice rough as burlap. Man's or machines, it remembers and it holds a grudge, or it gives a gift, depending on how you treat it. When my father took over, he was of a different generation, the generation of speed and efficiency. He bought our first tractor, a solid little machine that did the work of 4 horses and did it faster. He was a good farmer, my father. He made the farm profitable, kept us fed and clothed, sent me to agricultural college for 2 years. But something was different. The rhythm was gone. The work became a series of deadlines, of fighting the weather, of pushing the land to give more, faster. The conversations in the barn were about engine hours and fuel costs, not about the feel of the soil or the way the water was draining after a spring thaw. When he passed, the farm came to me. For 10 years, I farmed it his way. I bought a bigger tractor. I used the chemicals the extension agent recommended. I chased yields, just like everyone else. And the farm did okay. It paid its bills. But I felt a growing unease, a sense of being disconnected from the very ground I stood on. I was managing a factory floor, not tending a living thing. The decision came one winter. I was in the machine shed trying to get the big diesel tractor to start in the bitter cold. The battery was weak, the block heater wasn't working right, and my hands were numb. I spent 3 hours cursing and wrestling with frozen steel, and for what? To go out and drag a dozen tons of metal across soil that was frozen solid anyway. I looked over in the corner of the shed, and under a dusty canvas tarp was my grandfather's old walking plough. The handles were grey and smooth from his hands. I pulled off the tarp, and it was like uncovering a memory.
That night I talked to my wife, Martha. She's a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy. She listens more than she talks, and when she does talk, you'd best pay attention. I told her I was thinking of selling the tractor and the big implements. I told her I wanted to find a good team of draft horses and farm the old way. She stirred her coffee for a long time, the little spoon making a quiet scraping sound against the ceramic mug. She looked out the window at the dark fields, sleeping under a thin blanket of snow. Finally, she looked back at me. "How many acres are we talking about?" she asked. It was the only question that mattered. Not why, not what will the neighbors think, but can it be done? "Just the 80, I told her. "The 80 that matter, the home fields." She nodded slowly. "Your grandfather fed a family off those 80 acres with 2 horses," she said. "I suppose they can feed 2 of us." And that was that. The next spring, I sold the tractor. It felt like a weight lifting off the farm. Dave, my neighbor, was the one who bought it. He got a good deal. A few weeks later, I found Jacob and Esau at an Amish farm sale 3 counties over. They were brothers, 7 and 8 years old, already a working team. When I brought them home, the place felt right again. It was quiet, but it was a living quiet. The work was harder on my body, no doubt about it. It was slower. A day's ploughing with the team was what the tractor could do in an hour. But I was seeing things I hadn't seen in years. The way the soil crumbled behind the plowshare, dark and moist. The sheer number of earthworms. The way the birds would follow me, feasting in the furrow. I wasn't just driving over the land, I was part of it again. My grandfather's words would come back to me. "It's not about speed," he'd say, "it's about weight." I was just beginning, to understand what he meant. The co-op manager and the men at the diner, they saw the speed. They saw me moving at 3 miles an hour while the world moved at 60. They couldn't see the weight, the literal tons of pressure per square inch that their big new machines were pressing down onto the earth year after year, slowly squeezing the life out of it. I felt like I was breathing life back into my fields with every slow, deliberate step. One evening, a few years after I'd brought the horses home,
I was cleaning out the old tack room in the main barn, a space that hadn't been properly sorted through since my grandfather's time. Tucked away in a small wooden crate full of old harness buckles and leatherworking tools, I found it. It was a small black ledger book with a marbled cover, its corners soft and rounded with use. The pages were yellowed and filled with my grandfather's handwriting, a careful looping script done in pencil that had faded to a soft grey. It was his farm journal, dating from the late 1930s through the early 50s. I took it back to the house and sat with it under the kitchen light, a cup of coffee growing cold at my elbow. It was a record of a life lived in close conversation with the land. He noted planting dates, rainfall in fractions of an inch, the first frost and the last. Wind from the east, rain in 3 days, one entry read. Another, corn is knee-high but the leaves are rolling, needs a drink. He recorded yields, prices for hogs, the cost of a new harness. It was a simple, beautiful document, a testament to a life of attention. I read it for hours, lost in his world. Then I came to a page from the fall of 1947. He had been experimenting with a new variety of alfalfa, and he'd made notes on its growth. At the bottom of the page, almost as an afterthought, he had written a few lines separate from the main entry. He had drawn a rough sketch of a cross-section of soil, showing the topsoil and the layer beneath it. Beside the sketch, he wrote, "Clay pan at 8 inches. Does not compact.
Holds water but slow. Check roots after rain." And then, underlined twice, he'd added a final thought, a question he'd left for himself. Never dug. I stared at that page for a long time. I'll own that I had seen the notebook before, years ago when I first took over the farm. I'd flipped through it then, saw it as a historical curiosity, a relic of a bygone era. I'd seen that very line, never dug, and it had meant nothing to me. It was the note of a man who didn't have access to modern soil science, a man working with hunches and feelings. I had dismissed it. I put the notebook back in its crate then, because I wasn't ready to listen. I was still in the grip of the modern way, the belief that new knowledge always replaces old knowledge. But now, sitting there in the quiet kitchen, the words felt different. They felt like a map, a clue. That phrase, "does not compact," resonated with what I was seeing and feeling in my own fields. Most farms in our region dealt with hardpan. It was a dense, compacted layer of soil that formed about as deep as a plough could reach, usually 6 to 10 inches down. Year after year of heavy equipment rolling over the fields created this impermeable layer that plant roots struggled to break through. It limited their access to water and nutrients in the subsoil. Farmers fought it with deep ripping, using massive subsoiler ploughs that took immense horsepower to pull, and it was a temporary fix at best. My grandfather was suggesting our land, or at least a part of it, was different. He was saying that the clay layer on our farm, the one that started at 8 inches, had a different character. It wasn't a hard pan created by pressure. It was a natural layer that held moisture without becoming a brick wall. And his final, underlined note was a challenge, a piece of unfinished business. Never dug. He had observed, he had hypothesized, but he had never confirmed it. He had never taken a shovel and gone deep enough to see what the roots were actually doing down there, to see if they were getting through that clay pan after a rain when it was softened. He had left the question hanging, and in that moment I knew this was the work he had left for me to do. It wasn't just about using his tools, it was about finishing his thinking. The mockery from the neighbours, the pitying looks at the co-op, they all faded away. I wasn't just clinging to the past. I was trying to unearth a secret my grandfather had suspected was there all along. The secret wasn't in the horses. The horses were just the key. They were the method of farming that had preserved the soil's structure long enough for this secret to still matter. The real secret was in the ground itself.
8 inches down. And I was going to be the one to finally dig. The next morning, I was out before sunrise. The air was still and cool, and a heavy dew lay on the grass. I didn't take the horses. I took a spade, a post-hole digger, and a 5-gallon bucket. I walked to the fence line that separated my 80 acres from Dave's. It was the perfect place to make a comparison. The soil type was identical, part of the same geological formation. The only significant difference was how the two pieces of ground had been treated for the last decade. His with ever heavier machinery, mine with the light tread of two 2,000-pound horses. I started on his side of the fence. I had his permission. He was curious in an amused sort of way about what I was doing. "Looking for gold?" he'd called out from his tractor cab the day before. "Something like that," I'd replied. I chose a spot 20 feet into his cornfield, a place that would have seen countless passes from his tractor, his planter, his sprayer, his combine. I started with the spade. The first 6 inches were loose enough, the topsoil he worked every year. But then the shovel hit something. It wasn't a rock, it was a dull, solid thud. The ground became incredibly hard. I put my full weight on the spade and it barely sank another inch. This was the plough pan, the compacted layer. I switched to the post-hole digger. It was slow, difficult work. I had to chip away at the soil which came up in hard, dry clumps. It was pale, dense clay, almost devoid of any structure. There were no worm channels, no old root paths. It was like trying to dig through sun-baked brick. After half an hour of hard labour, I had a hole about 2 feet deep. The sides of the hole were smooth and sheer where the hard pan layer was, a clear line of demarcation at about 8 inches. A plant's roots would hit that wall and be forced to spread out horizontally, forever trapped in the shallow layer of topsoil, competing for water and nutrients. I moved back to my side of the fence, walking the same 20 feet into my own field. I braced myself for the same fight. I pushed the spade into the ground. It sank.
It went down a full foot with just the pressure of my arms in 1 foot. There was no thud, no wall. I pulled out a spadeful of earth. It was beautiful, dark, crumbly, threaded with a web of fine roots and alive with earthworms. It smelled sweet and alive. I switched to the post-hole digger, not because I needed the power, but because I wanted to see the column of soil it would pull up. I dug down 2 feet, then 3. The soil changed character as I went deeper, becoming more clay-like as I passed that 8-inch mark my grandfather had written about. But it was never compacted. It was structured, made of aggregates, little clumps of soil bound together. It was riddled with pores and channels. It was a living soil all the way down. I could see where old roots had died and decayed, leaving pathways for air and water to penetrate deep into the ground. This was the gift of the horses. Their weight was spread over 4 broad, flat hooves.
They didn't apply the same intense, life-crushing pressure as a tire. Their passing didn't shatter the soil structure, it preserved it. I sat there on the edge of the hole, running the dark soil through my fingers. My grandfather had been right. Does not compact. The clay pan was there, but on my land, it wasn't a barrier. It was a reservoir. That porous structure meant it could hold water from the spring rains deep into the dry spells of July and August, acting like a sponge. The roots could follow the channels down and drink from that reservoir when the topsoil was parched. Dave's roots would be hitting a brick wall and withering. Mine would be tapping into a hidden well. That afternoon, I decided on an experiment. I would dedicate 5 acres, my best drained piece of bottomland, to a crop that would prove the theory. Not corn, not soybeans. Their value was in tonnage, and I couldn't compete there. I needed something that was valued for its quality. Something whose quality was directly tied to the health of the soil and the depth of its roots. I chose a specific old variety of parsnip, a notoriously difficult crop to grow well. To reach its full potential, it needed to send a single, straight taproot deep into the earth without obstruction. In compacted soil, the roots would be stunted, forked, and bitter. But in soil like mine, I suspected they could grow long, straight, and sweet. It was a gamble, a 5-acre garden plot, as the co-op manager would later call it. But I wasn't gambling on myself. I was placing a bet on my grandfather's wisdom and the living soil beneath my feet. The work of that 5-acre plot became the center of my year. It was farming on a different scale, more like gardening, requiring a level of attention I hadn't given a field in a long time. Preparing the seedbed was a slow, careful process. I used a lighter walking plow, then followed with a disc and a spring-tooth harrow, the horses moving at a steady, unhurried walk. Every pass was a conversation with the soil. I could feel its texture through the rains, the slight changes in resistance that told me about moisture content and tilth. There was no roar of an engine to deafen me to the land's subtleties. I could hear the whisper of the soil as it turned. Planting was done with a single-row horse-drawn planter, a piece of equipment that was probably 70 years old, but worked as well as the day it was made. It was precise, slow work, walking the long rows, Jacob and Esau responding to the slightest command, their big hooves landing gently between the rows. Dave would sometimes stop his big green machine at the fence line and watch me for a few minutes. He never said anything dismissive, not directly. He'd just shake his head with a little smile, the look of a man watching another man try to empty the ocean with a teacup. One day, the co-op manager drove out. His truck was clean, his boots were not. He stood at the edge of the field, a clipboard in his hand. "Heard you were trying something different," he said. I told him I was. He looked at the 5 acres of carefully prepared ground. "Parsnips," he said, as if the word itself was a punchline. "You know the commodity price on parsnips is next to nothing. You'll never get your tonnage. You could get 200 bushels of corn off this ground." I nodded. "I'm not looking for tonnage," I said. He looked at me, then at the horses grazing peacefully at the end of the rows. He sighed the sigh of a man burdened by the follies of others. "Well," he said, making a note on his clipboard, "it's your fuel bill." He got back in his truck and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust that settled on the edges of my field. The summer was a dry one. By mid-July, the corn in Dave's fields was showing distress. The leaves were curling in the afternoon heat, a plant's way of trying to conserve moisture. My parsnips, however, looked fine. Their green, feathery tops were lush and healthy. I knew why. His corn roots were trapped in the top 8 inches of soil, which was now baked hard and dry. My parsnip taproots were 20 inches down, drinking cool water from the clay subsoil that my grandfather had written about. They were thriving on the moisture my soil had saved for them. I spent the summer cultivating, keeping the weeds down with a horse-drawn cultivator, a delicate process of steering the steel tines between the narrow rows. It was quiet, meditative work. During that time, I felt closer to my grandfather than I had since I was a boy. I was seeing the field through his eyes, understanding his notes not as abstract observations, but as practical instructions. I was finishing the work he had started. In late August, after a rare soaking rain, I did what he had suggested in his notebook. I went out to the field with a shovel. I carefully excavated around one of the plants at the edge of a row. I dug down, gently loosening the soil until I could pull the entire root out intact. I washed it with water from a bucket. It was perfect. It was over 18 inches long, straight as an arrow, with a smooth, pale skin. It was exactly what the seed catalogue had promised, the kind of result you only see in pictures. It was the physical proof of my theory. The ground didn't just remember the weight of a heavy foot, it remembered the kindness of a light one. I knew then that I had something special, but having it and selling it for what it was worth were two different things. I'd heard of a man, a buyer from the city who worked directly with high-end restaurants and specialty grocers. He didn't deal in commodities, he dealt in quality. He was known for being particular, almost impossible to please. I found his number and made the call. I told him I had a crop of parsnips I thought he might be interested in. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Everyone thinks that," he said, his voice flat. "What makes yours different?" You have to come and see, I told him. He agreed to a visit the following week, but there was no enthusiasm in his voice. I knew he was expecting to waste a trip to see another deluded farmer with a patch of mediocre vegetables. I wasn't worried. The proof was in the ground. The buyer arrived on the Thursday afternoon. He didn't drive a fancy truck, but a modest, clean sedan that looked out of place on my gravel lane. He was an older man, maybe my age, with quiet eyes and hands that looked like they had handled a lot of produce in their time. He wore simple work clothes, but they were neat, and his boots were scuffed from walking fields, not from kicking tires on a dealer's lot. His name was Samuel. He didn't offer much in the way of small talk. He just nodded a greeting and said, "Show me what you have." I led him out to the 5-acre plot. He stopped at the edge and just looked for a long time, taking in the whole field. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. He saw the evenness of the stand, the health of the foliage, the lack of tractor tire tracks. He walked out into the field, bending down to touch the soil. He crumbled it between his fingers, smelled it. He walked a dozen rows, his gaze fixed on the ground and the base of the plants. I just stood back and let him look. I knew this was not a man you could persuade with words. The crop and the soil had to speak for themselves. Finally, he turned to me. "Dig one," he said. It was a command, not a request. I took my spade, the one I always carried with me to the field, and chose a plant at random from the middle of the row. I did as I had done before, digging carefully and deeply around it to not break the long taproot. I loosened the earth all around it, and then, with both hands, I gently worked it free. I pulled it from the ground. It came out clean and whole, a perfect, creamy white spear nearly 2 feet long. I handed it to him. He took it and held it in his hands, feeling the heft of it. He turned it over and over, examining it from every angle. He took a small pocket knife from his pocket, a well-worn knife with a carbon steel blade, and sliced a piece from the thickest part of the root. He held it to his nose, inhaling deeply. Then he broke it in half. The snap was clean and crisp. He looked at the cross-section and the dense, fine-grained flesh. He stayed like that for what felt like a very long time, utterly silent, his attention completely focused on the parsnip in his hands. The silence was heavier than any words could have been. In that moment, he wasn't just a buyer, and I wasn't just a farmer. We were two old men who understood that the truth of a thing is not in how it's marketed, but in what it is. He was seeing the result of a decade of light-footed farming, of my grandfather's quiet observation of a living, breathing soil. He was seeing a story written in a vegetable. He finally looked up from the root and met my eyes. He didn't smile. His face was serious, thoughtful. He looked from the parsnip to the field, then back to the parsnip. He cleared his throat. "Substantial," he said. It was just one word, delivered flatly, without emotion. But in the quiet of that field, it landed with the force of a thunderclap. It was validation. It was recognition. It was everything. He then explained what he was seeing. He spoke of sugar content, of nutrient density, of how the lack of stress on the plant, thanks to the deep moisture reserve, prevented the development of woody, bitter flavors. He said the chefs he worked with were looking for this, for produce that had character, that tasted of the place where it was grown. They call it terroir when they talk about wine, he said. They're starting to understand it applies to everything that comes out of the ground. He asked about my methods, about the horses. I told him the story, about my grandfather, about the notebook, about the compacted soil on the other side of the fence. He listened, nodding slowly. Not like a man hearing a tall tale, but like a man hearing an explanation for something he already knew to be true. Before he left, he pulled a contract from a briefcase in his car. He offered me a price per pound that was nearly 10 times the commodity price. It wasn't a price for parsnips. It was a price for quality, a price for attention, a price for farming in a way that honored the ground. "I'll take the whole field," he said. "And I want to talk to you about what you're planting next year." We shook hands. His grip was firm, dry. As he drove away, I stood there holding the perfect heavy parsnip in my hand. The evening sun was turning the sky gold, and the only sound was the gentle snorting of Jacob and Esau as they grazed in the pasture. The ground remembers, my grandfather had said. It turned out he was right. It remembered, and it had given a gift. The harvest took 3 weeks. It was slow, methodical work. Each parsnip had to be individually loosened with a digging fork and lifted by hand to avoid breaking the long roots. It was back-breaking labour, but I hired a few young folks from the town who were looking for work, and we fell into a rhythm. Every afternoon we would carefully pack the harvested roots into wooden crates, lining them to prevent bruising. The main barn, which for years had stood half empty, began to fill up, not with loose grain piled high, but with neat stacks of crates, each one holding a small fortune in vegetables. The sweet, earthy smell of them filled the old building. My other 2 barns, the smaller ones I used for hay and equipment storage, also began to fill. We needed the space to sort and crate the sheer volume of what was coming out of that 5-acre patch. The yield wasn't high in terms of raw tonnage, not compared to a corn crop, but the value of what we were stacking was staggering. It was a different kind of wealth. It was quiet, dense, and carefully handled. The first of Samuel's refrigerated trucks arrived on a Monday morning. It was a full-sized semi, and it backed down my lane just as Dave was heading out in his big green tractor to start on his soybean harvest. Dave stopped, his engine idling with that familiar deep rumble. He watched as the truck backed up to my barn doors. He watched as we started loading the crates, forklifted out onto the loading dock I had hastily built. He couldn't see what was in the crates, but he could see the truck. He could see the professional operation, and he could do the math. A truck that size wasn't coming for a few bushels of garden vegetables. He sat there in his cab for a good 10 minutes just watching. I was too busy to pay him much mind, but I was aware of his presence, a silent observer at the edge of my world. The loading took most of the morning. When the truck was finally full and the driver was securing the doors, Dave finally put his machine in gear and drove over to the fence line. He shut off the engine, and the sudden silence was startling. He leaned out of the cab. "That's a big truck for a little garden," he said. There was no mockery in his voice this time, just curiosity. "It was a good year for parsnips," I said, walking over to the fence. He looked at my barns, all 3 of them with their doors open, all of them filled with stacks of identical wooden crates waiting for the next truck. He looked back at me. He chewed on his lip for a moment, thinking. He was a smart man, Dave. He was putting the pieces together. The strange crop, the dry summer, the big truck. "Heard you got a good price on those roots," he said finally. The word roots sounded foreign in his mouth. A man used to talking in bushels and acres. "It was a fair price," I said. He nodded, looking down at his hands on the steering wheel. He looked out across his own fields and the hundreds of acres of soybeans he was about to harvest, a crop whose price was determined by a board of trade 1,000 miles away. He looked at the massive tires on his machine, the tires that were pressing his own soil into a lifeless plate. For the first time, I think he saw the fence between us, not as a line separating a modern farm from an antique one, but as a line separating 2 different ideas about what farming was. He looked at me again. "My grandfather," he said, his voice quiet. "He used to talk about the soil, said you had to listen to it." I just nodded. There was nothing else to say. He started the tractor up again, the big engine roaring to life. He gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod, and then he drove on, heading toward his own harvest. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't a conversion. It was something smaller and more meaningful. It was a moment of acknowledgement, a quiet concession. He still had his way, and I had mine, but the space between us had changed. The laughter had stopped, and I knew that from now on, when he looked over the fence, he wouldn't just be seeing a couple of old horses. He'd be wondering what was happening in the ground beneath their feet. That night, after the last truck had gone,
I took my grandfather's notebook out to the barn.
I sat on a stack of empty crates and read that entry one more time. Never dug. I took a pencil from my pocket, its lead worn and blunt, and below his words, in my own rough hand, I added a single line. Dug today. You were right. The work wasn't finished, but a promise had been kept. The ground had been listened to, and the bonds were full.